The national vote recount has established clearly how the tabulation of votes in District 4 was rigged to make a declaration in favor of the coalition APNU+AFC and deny the PPP victory. But the recount is not yet complete, and there are very nervous days ahead. There are lingering questions about whether the process would be derailed, and if it is not and the recount is completed, would there be any maneuvers to prevent a declaration of the results based on the figures from the recount?
Well, the bottom line is, I think it's like I've said before, one of the clearest examples of a naked attempt to rig elections right in front of the eyes of the people.
Anand Prasad has worked with the independent Starbuck News since 1989 and is now its editor-in-chief.
It's clear, I think, to everybody who is independent observer and anybody who wants to uphold the rule of law that there was an attempt, and there continues to be an attempt, to rig the elections, and that must not happen. That must be stopped at all points along the way, and it's something that is extremely important for the protection of the democracy of the country.
This is News Talk Radio Guyana 103.1 FM. It's now time for a Periscope on Politics, a look at the latest political developments in Guyana from an analytical perspective.
Dennis Chabral, a veteran journalist, has covered the past 6 elections in Guyana.
You know, at one point I thought that the 1992 elections, for all its history, was the most controversial, and perhaps the elections that I thought might have been derailed, having regard to the widespread protests in the city, allegations of people being unable to vote, people's names not being found on the correct lists, and then we had the whole riot and all of that. There was this feeling, though, that given what had been happening in the PNC between then President Hoyt and Mr. Hamilton Green and his allies, that the elections may have been called off, for the want of a better word. But I never in my wildest imaginations believed that we would have found ourselves in 2020 where elections results would have taken so long to be delivered.
Just what happened in District 4 to derail the entire 2020 elections has been showing up in the national vote recount, which started on May 6th. What is clear is that the figures for APNU+AFC were jacked up to hand the coalition a victory.
We have box 41, 45. Figures here are for the APNU+AFC, we have 180, and the PPP 102. Now the PPP figure was the same, but this particular box was inflated by 90 votes for APNU+AFC, which brings it to a total of 270. We have another box, 4164. This box had 54 votes for the APNU+AFC, and they added 50 to this box for the APNU+AFC. The PPP votes remain the same.
Shazam Ali of the Citizenship Initiative has been compiling the results of the national vote recount, which show the extent to which the electoral process in District 4 was manipulated.
And I'll show you another box, 4151. This had 165 votes for the APNU+AFC, and they added 60 votes to the APNU+AFC total. This SOR did match the SOP that we found on the PPP SOP website. So I can come to the conclusion that all of the PPP SOPs for Region 4 so far are real. It's shameful what has happened so far. I've spoken to a lot of people who support the coalition and silently doing it, how ashamed they are of what happened, what took place at Ashman's Building and what took place at the Kingston headquarters.
What took place, Shaz? How would you describe it? Fraud, rigging, malpractice? How would you describe it?
Electoral fraud. It's plain and straight, electoral fraud. It was transparent to everybody to see. Everybody saw what happened, everybody. There was no secret. People were saying that the GCOM staff were like bombarded by the party agents and so on, but there was a reason. Everybody was seeing the wrong that was taking place. Nobody wanted to stay quiet. Seeing something like that go wrong in front of your own eyes, how can anybody sit back and just allow it to happen?
The general and regional elections were held on March 2nd. The fact is that by the evening of the day after the vote, the Tuesday, the two major political powers, the PPP and APNU+AFC, knew for sure who had won the elections. They had statements of poll produced at each of the country's 2,339 polling stations which proved this. And so a plot was hatched. A way had to be found to show how the coalition won. And it had to be done fast because the tabulation of the statements of poll which show how many votes were cast for each party at all the polling stations in the district was well along, and any undue delay would raise suspicions. The evening of the Tuesday, the vote count was suspended when just after half of the statements of poll were counted for the district. The dark hours would be used to set the plan in motion, but by 9 a.m. start time the next day, Wednesday, everything was not in order. More time was needed. While the numbers were being doctored and the tabulation process being stalled, an ambulance was called in for the returning officer Claremont Mingo. He spent some time at the hospital, but was back on his feet in the afternoon. A spreadsheet was prepared for him on his return, and he entered the room with it.
Arrived at these broadsheets. I took each statement of poll, input it into our computer, tabulated them, and come up with these broadsheets for each polling station.
Mr. Mingo, how can we verify that, excuse me, how can we verify that what you've inputted from your SOPs is the correct figures? That's why we need a verification process.
If you have yours, you can follow me. That's all I'm saying. If you have yours, follow me.
And then if it does not follow?
If it does not follow, then there's a course of action which is specified in the law you can follow.
So no verification of SOPs or SOPs?
No.
But you'll be reading from each SOP.
From this sheet.
No, that's not an SOP. The law doesn't care for a
The
spreadsheet.
information on this is extracted from my SOPs.
He had the GCOM agent call out numbers one after the other, rapidly. No one could follow, and they could not stop him.
Mr. Mingo, can I humbly ask that she slows down a little bit so we can get the numbers in?
4057.
What was clear is that the numbers being called did not match the numbers from the statements of poll, and the manipulation of the numbers was done so clumsily that there was no time to apply any science, just add and subtract. Listen to the numbers being called and take a look at what the recount has proven. We begin with box number 4057.
ANA 0, APNU+AFC 165.
165 for APNU? Wrong. The actual figure, as shown by the recount, was 105, and so Mr. Mingo added 60 for APNU+AFC. Now listen to the number called for the PPP.
CG 0, LJP 0, PPPC 50.
The actual figure was 70, not 50, so Mr. Mingo subtracted 20 from the PPP. Let's take another box, 4058. Listen to the number for APNU+AFC.
4058, ANA 0, APNU+AFC 163.
The actual figure for APNU+AFC, as shown by the recount, was 93, so Mr. Mingo added 70. Now listen to the figure called for the PPP.
LJP 0, PPPC 71.
The actual figure for the PPP was not 71, but rather 91. So here again, Mr. Mingo subtracted 20 from the PPP. We move to yet another box, 4150. Listen to the number called for APNU+AFC.
4150, ANA 0, APNU+AFC 237.
The actual figure for APNU+AFC, as shown by the recount, was 207 and not 237, so Mr. Mingo added 30. And this pattern continued for many, many more boxes. Of the 879 statements, Mr. Mingo used his spreadsheet with numbers no one could verify for about 400 until he returned to using the actual statements on the night of March 13th, using this makeshift projector screen, making it difficult for anyone to see what was on those statements. At polling station 4054, where President David Granger voted at the Pearl Nursery School, the votes for the coalition were bumped up as much as 90. So from what you've been saying, it has been almost a pattern of adding 50, adding 90, adding 60. There wasn't an effort to say, let's put a 19 so it will look a bit off, or a 30. And this was zeros at the end of whatever number.
Right. All was like 10 or 20 votes. It's like the 10 times table. 10 votes, 20 votes, 30 votes, as high as 90 votes so far. And even taken away from the PPP, 20 votes, 10 votes, 30 votes.
With the first declaration by returning officer Claremont Mingo deemed by the High Court as having breached the country's electoral laws, Mr. Mingo made a second declaration, but that too was called into question. We tried to contact Mr. Mingo on the telephone number provided by GCOM, but multiple attempts were met by the same response.
Hello?
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Neil Marks. I was trying to reach Mr. Claremont Mingo, please.
It's not around.
Do you have any idea of when I may be able to get him?
No.
Or does he have another number I may contact him on?
No. No, I don't have a next number. Okay, bye.
With the declarations of Mr. Mingo set aside, a recount was ordered, not just for District 4, but all the 10 electoral districts. The recount began on May 6th amid tight security. One thing was for sure, no cameras would be allowed in the building. But there was a window of opportunity for the newsroom. So we are inside the Arctic Chong Conference Center. So this is the health tent that we are passing in order to get access to the conference center. We're going to try to go around to the back where the containers are, because that's where they have to open in order to get the ballot boxes out and to begin this recount process. So it's a bit of a long journey to get behind the conference center. So it seems that we're not going to go there. We're going to go inside of the conference center. We were hoping to get them when they're opening the containers, but that doesn't seem to be happening. We've been called to the conference center, so hopefully we will get pictures of them opening the ballot containers. Morning, yeah. Just after I cleared security, I was met by the chair of GCOM, Justice Claudette Singh. Shortly after, my cameraman was told to leave. I was told by the GCOM chair that I would be allowed to film the opening of the first set of ballot boxes, but she was promptly told by a security officer that she could not allow me to do that, and that was that. She told me to wait for a while, and I did. I was subsequently escorted to see this box being opened, and I filmed it with my phone. As the days went by, the fraud that went down in the tabulation for District 4 started to emerge.
Our first election that we covered was in 1992, and that was meant to be the restoration of democracy. So I cannot understand how from 1992 we could descend into this total abhorrent situation where in the globally changed environment with no Cold War around, that there could be an attempt again at this time to rig elections. Totally unacceptable. And it is clear that the writing is on the wall. The international communities made it clear. The local communities made it clear. This cannot work. That is, you cannot steal people's votes. When you try to steal people's votes, what you do is to dehumanize them. And what you're doing is saying that they don't participate. They are people who are non-existent and they're not part of the political framework. That cannot be accepted and that cannot be tolerated.
Timothy Jonas, an attorney at law and chairman of A New and United Guyana, has been assessing what has been showing up in the recount.
So the fraud is there. The fraud is there for everyone to see. There's no doubt about it. It is documented and proved. That is evidence. It is admissible in court. So as this has gone on, it has become obvious that the narrative could not be we won a fair election and Mingo's count was right. So the narrative has changed. And what the narrative changed to was that PPP also rigged.
We were accused, and the new parties were accused of getting SOPs from the PPP, and let me be straight that we did not get any SOP from the PPP. All of it were independently gathered from our members and other candidates from wherever they voted. So we were waiting for those boxes to appear and get to compare the figures at the same time. And from the recount now, all the figures so far from the SORs as compared to the PPP SOPs, they all match. So this proves that all the PPP SOPs for Region 4 so far are real.
There were genuine copies of what came out of those statements from the polls.
Yeah, they were genuine copies of what came out of the statement of the polls. And everyone was asking us, where did we get our SOPs from? And we were telling them where we get our SOPs from, but no one was asking where did the coalition get their SOPs, or where is the coalition SOPs.
One by one, representatives of APNU+AFC came with their stories that the names of persons who were either dead or out of the country on March 2nd were ticked off as having voted.
My God, in the PPP strongholds, let me tell you what has been happening. The dead got up, voted, and went back to rest. The dead.
Because we have gotten the information from field work, we do not have access, at least I do not have access to immigration records, nor do I have access to any other nor do I have access to any physical evidence. But what I have is confirmation from family members of these people who are on the list, and they said that their family member was not in the country to vote.
I'm asking you about the valid, credible claims that the party would have been making, objecting to. What have you backed up? One single claim where we have something to back it up to.
And I'm saying to you that I have backed up my allegation of migration with yes, I'm not going to dispute it.
What we want here now is in this recount process, the entire truth to come out. Entire truth. Because they had one truth about Mingo and this and that and whatever it is. Good. But there are other truths that are very much fundamental, and it is important.
Yeah, I just think it's absolutely ludicrous. What is at the bottom of those claims is what you would say is multiple voting. That is, somebody's going to the polling station and voting in their own name, and then returning to that polling station or going to another polling station and voting for somebody who is supposedly dead or was not in the country at the time. Now, there are safeguards for all of those things. You have to resemble the person who you are attempting to vote for. There's a folio at each polling station which has a photograph of the person who you are attempting to impersonate, which is what you call personation. So you're attempting to impersonate somebody who is on the folio. That person must look like you. Because if that person doesn't look like you, you will be thrown out of the polling station and you probably would be arrested on the site. There's a police person there. They're there to maintain order and to deal with complaints that might be there. So once you go into that polling station and you attempt to impersonate somebody, you'll be found out right away. And if you voted already, you would have to have shown your finger. And one of the things that we have had to use in this country, because there's been so much confusion over the electoral history of rigging, you have to have your finger inked. So at some point where you're going to cast your ballot, your finger would have been checked and it would have been seen that you had had indelible ink on that. So there are any number of safeguards that would prevent any type of that voting supposedly for dead people or people who've migrated. So that's all baloney. It's nothing that should be of concern to anybody who's seriously interested in a fair election.
The next thing that I think is more dangerous that APNU is trying to do is talk about the joint forces and trying to sell a bridge to the effect that the joint forces, their votes didn't count because they weren't stamped. Now that's an outright lie, and it's a dangerous lie, because the joint forces are the bodies that enforce the laws in our country and have the muscle to do that. If they are aggrieved because of a lie from one side, that creates a dangerous situation in our country.
There are no examples that I can think of where the media has failed to report on the cases that APNU+AFC has presented. And one in particular has been this ridiculous assertion by Mr. Harman that the discipline services votes were not considered because they were deliberately not stamped by presiding officers at polling stations. There is no way, given maybe Mr. Harman doesn't know this, there is no way that those votes could be determined to be of discipline services voters because they are simply mixed with certain polling stations, in particular because you'd like to make sure you preserve the identity of the discipline services voting people so that nobody will know how they voted. So when all of those ballot papers are intermixed at each polling station, nobody knows which ballot paper is from a discipline services voting as opposed to one from echoes. So to say that those things were deliberately not stamped as a means of preventing the votes of discipline services voters from being considered is nonsense, because there's no way of telling which ballot paper has been ticked off by a discipline services voting.
The 25-day timeline ended on Saturday, and an additional 2 weeks has been given to complete the process, but there is no stopping the unsubstantiated objections being raised.
Every time a box comes in to be counted, and the APNU rep will call off a list of numbers of voters on that list represented in that box, to ask if these numbers, if the people represented by these numbers voted. I can give you an example today where the APNU rep called 149 names, 149 numbers, to ask if these people voted. And of that, I understand 20 were ticked off as having voted. So it's a large fishing net. There's no science to this thing. You just call numbers at random. 149. And if you find any of them that have voted, then you say those people are out of the country. You don't provide any evidence of that, any information of that. But the compliant and complicit GCOM official religiously writes in the observation report, APNU rep says these 20 names are out of the country. And that is documented. And it's a funny thing about putting something in writing. If I tell you a lie, it's easy to discard it. But when you write that lie down, somehow it gets weight. Somehow it's given credence. And what's happened is that this magic report by the APNU agent saying 20 people out the country has somehow, because it is on a piece of paper, been given credence by APNU and by the APNU supporters. So these observation reports are going back to GCOM, and no one knows what's going to happen with them.
What happens to them, those observation reports with the claims of the names of dead persons and those out of the country having voted, would in large part depend on the chair of the commission.
I think any commission chairman faces pressure. No commission chairman, as far as I recall, has ever been able to perform satisfactorily to all of the political parties, especially the two main political parties. Win or lose, you'll find one protesting against the commission chairman, even passing by their residences, whether it be Queenstown or Lamaha Gardens, and criticizing the chairman, calling him out a rigor of elections, while the other side will feel satisfied and will either stay quiet or praise that commission chairman. So yes, any commission chairman will indeed come under pressure. For this chairman, I believe that above all else, she is a former judge, so she is looking at things from a legal perspective, and she also has to conduct an assessment of the political environment and coming to whatever decision she has to come to. From the outside, I get the impression that she really takes through a lot of her decision making through a deliberative process, hearing arguments from both sides as if it were a court of law, and then coming to her decision. It is now left to the public to see whether indeed this is the best approach, or she takes the bull by the horns like Steve Surge-Bally and say yes or no. definitively in a short space of time. But the chairman is a lawyer by profession. So, she's a former judge. So I think she takes a lot of things into consideration.
After the recount is completed for each of the 10 electoral districts, a certificate with the total votes cast for each party is prepared and signed off. Once all the districts are completed, the Chief Elections Officer will have to add up the totals from the 10 certificates and present a report to GCOM for it to declare the results. What will happen to the volumes upon volumes of objections that have been raised remains to be seen. The Chief Elections Officer will have to present a summary.
The order says he does the maths you're talking about. So he informs the commission, this is the recount, this is the maths. Easy job. And then, as you say, the order says, and it uses the word summary of the observations. That is not an analysis. It's not an assessment of whether they're true or not. It's not a critique. It's a summary, and a summary is just an abbreviated version. So to me, a summary will say there were 20 objections, and the nature of the objections were this, and the total number of ballots involved in the objection were this, and no further evidence was presented. Or the following evidence was presented. But that is all he can do. It is not for him at all to try to justify or denigrate the objections, not to validate them or reject them. He has no place in assessing them. And that is what needs to be said to the country now, because I think he's going to step outside of bounds.
Even at this stage, we seem to have any precision as to what will indeed happen after the recount process. We know, yes, there will be a declaration one way or the other, but the question remains to be answered is what will happen coming out of the recount, especially since you have that clause in the recount order that says that it is the commission, as we know it's pretty much politically divided, will have to decide whether to accept, whether the Chief Elections Officer should use the data to compile a report to send it back to the commission. What if the commission says we do not want the Chief Elections Officer to use that data? Or what if there's another loophole that is found that says no, the recount data cannot be used? So I think these questions will eventually, the answers will unfold as we get closer to June 16, which is now the new deadline that GCOM has set itself for the declaration of the results.
What I would expect is that when the result goes to the GCOM chair, forget what the other commissioners do. It's the GCOM chair who is going to make the decision. She has the last opportunity that she will be given, I presume, to do what's right. There are very many questions about what she did on March 5th and March 13th that could call into question whether or not she's committed to a free and fair election. Because clearly she should have stopped the Mingo Declaration on March 5th. She should have stopped the Mingo Declaration on March 13th. She did nothing. She's made a number of decisions that I would question whether or not she really is committed to free and fair elections. So she has one last opportunity to show that she is committed to free and fair elections. When she gets that result and the recount is concluded fairly, she has to present to the public what the result of the recount is. And that is the decision, and then you declare the winner of the election. That's what she has to do.
With just about 2 weeks left for the recount, most are still jittery about what could happen. What further surprises could be ahead for Guyanese waiting for results for an elections held 3 months ago?
They have some options. They can stop the count. They can use COVID. They can, use anything. So they can stop the process. That doesn't put them good with the foreigners. But it also, I don't think, allows the chairman to declare and swear in David Granger, because I don't think she will do that. Her reputation would be in tatters if she did that. And therefore, the chancellor can't swear him in. So stopping the process has its own difficulty for the incumbents. They would actually have to take over the whole process and force a swearing in. That would be beyond the pale. I think it's difficult even for them to do it. So they have to see it to the end. At the end, unless GCOM is able to manipulate, the recount will show a loss by APNU.